Let's see. All right, it looks like we are recording.
All right. Excellent.
So, hi everyone. Mercury here. Ryan's busy today, so he won't be joining us, but I'm here with Khemit, who many of you will know from a couple of his previous appearances.
Yeah, that's my third one.
Yeah, which I think that makes you our the person who's been on the most, if I'm not mistaken. Well,
nice.
Other than Dr. Strachan, there's that series, but other than him, yeah, you're the person who's been on the most so far.
Do I win a prize or anything?
I wish we had prizes to give out.
Yeah.
So, what did you want to talk about today?
Yeah, well, I figured, I guess, first off, I don't know who's watching us right now. Well, I've seen the last two appearances, but maybe I'll give just a brief introduction and then we can dive into our topic. Well, first off, I wanted to talk to you specifically because I've seen through some of your t-shirts and some of the things you've said that you're a fellow comic book file. So it's a huge interest area of mine too. So I figured it would be a good conversation to have, especially because the main focus of my work is on fiction and how it resonates with people and what that may mean for our lives. So again, my name is Khemit Bailey. I am the founder of the Character Arc, which is a business where I have a course, it's a community, there's a podcast, and I also do some transition consulting, basically to help people to move from one phase of life to another phase, so personal or professional. But I do that using the vehicle of resonance with fiction. So, when you're watching a movie, there's something that's happening with you, not just with the movie itself. And so I use that connection to actually get at people's deeper values, which helps them figure out what the implications are for what they should be doing next. The reason that we got in touch the first time was because I also run the self-authoring collaboration group on Facebook, which is just a good place for anyone who's interested in self-authoring to go for motivation, discussion, questions or resources around Jordan Peterson's self-authoring program. So that's me.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I've got flies crawling on my camera occasionally.
I lock myself in this room so that flies can't get in here. It's just this time of year here in Lisbon is like fly central.
Yeah, and here this is such an old house. My great grandfather built it, and I'm out in the country.
That's awesome.
So these old houses out here get just full of flies certain times a year.
Okay.
But yeah, what you were saying about how the way fiction resonates with us tells us a lot about ourselves, I found very, very powerful. In fact, I noticed that recently. Grizz had read the book, Alan Moore's book, Jerusalem. And I found talking to him after, even though we read the same book, we didn't play the same story in our heads.
Yeah.
There were parts of it for me that seemed to just shine forth as like a major theme in certain parts that Grizz didn't find a theme of the book at all.
Yeah. That phenomenon is really the crux of the issue there. I think it's the implications of that are so deep but we never really think about it that way, because that means that the story isn't just a story, right? Because if you can read the same thing as someone else but have a completely different experience, that means that the difference is something about you, not the story. And so you can delve into that. It tells you more about what it is about you that resonates so much with that thing. I have that experience all the time with myself and with my clients. But yeah. Well, I was gonna ask, are you a big Alan Moore fan? Is that
Yeah, I'm a huge Alan Moore fan. I was into his comic books from a fairly young age. I was 11 or 12 when I got Watchmen.
Yeah. Wow.
For Vendetta is obviously such a huge one. But also after a few years ago when I got more seriously into high magic, ritual magic and interacting, the imaginative realm as though it's a real place, I was really surprised to find out that Alan Moore had become a magician. Now, he wasn't at the point where he'd written all the stuff I knew him for. So, back in the days of Watchmen, Swamp Thing and all of that. Although I feel even back then, he was connected to that realm the way many are. But he said it was his 40th birthday was when he became a magician. And I had a similar experience, at the age of 39, of sort of accidentally becoming a magician the way he did.
Okay.
And I found out his story about that after. And then since then, as much as I loved him before, I just find him all the more fascinating. Like,
Yeah.
now that he's gone on to live out basically a fictional life, like his life story sounds more like a comic book.
It does. Yeah. Yeah. As if he needed to go even further out on any limb, right? That guy, he was already so out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I guess when you talk about, I wrote a post about magic recently because I was talking about magic in fiction, right? And like the function that it plays, because magic to me seems to be like a placeholder for the vehicle by which like meaning inserts itself into your life. You know,
Yep.
So if you look at magic, it's always kind of like the catalyst there. And you see a lot of stories that nowadays, like movies especially, where magic is missing from the world and it's up to the hero to kind of bring it back, or the magic kind of ushers in the age of heroism again. I think that's a really unique theme to our times, especially. And I think it maybe is the reason that a lot of the writers that I like so much focus on magic so much. Like, you know, Grant Morrison is, I know, big into chaos magic, and in The Invisibles, that's pretty much all The Invisibles is about, is just, you know, magic and his particular interest in it. So I definitely think it's something that's happening in our time. What do you, I mean, I don't know that much about magic. I know about it tangentially through those authors, but what do you mean when you talk about magic?
So for me, even though since getting into it, I've looked into various traditions, I'm sort of like extremely old school. I've taken magic from like the very primitive level of, it seems to me, and perhaps not all insanity, but it seems to me a certain amount of insanity is where the magic initially came from, the early shamans and whatnot. So for me, it's unfolded through direct experience.
Okay.
So even before and before I got into magic, I always found that a silly word. And before that, I was into things about enlightenment. I was into like spiritual things and, you know, a belief in gods and angels and that kind of thing. But to me, magic is the intentional interaction with that kind of stuff. And I've done it more from, again, somewhat similar to Alan Moore, where even though he's gone and done plenty of studying in different traditions, he said himself that a lot of his stuff is just, it's sort of intuition, and it's doing some sort of meaningful ritual, even that you sort of develop yourself, trusting that it actually means something. Yeah. And I think a lot of the traditions, like a lot of the ritual and stuff, seems to be about seducing the subconscious, like getting your conscious mind out of the way. When you create a ritual and go through it, you very much enter a different world where the imagination seems more real. You separate yourself from the real world. And I don't know how much of it is actual metaphysical stuff and how much of it's psychological. And to a certain degree, like, yeah, both Alan Moore and Jordan Peterson have said something along the lines of whether the gods are inside of us or outside of us doesn't matter that much. You know, they're fucking gods. So I look at it that way, and I don't always know how much of it's psychological and how much of it's metaphysical, but I've begun to not care so much about that.
Yeah.
Because for me, one thing insanity taught me was how much I was never living in the real world. The old me, I thought I was living in the real world, which is where you fall into arguing with people so much and trying to project your values. And after going crazy, I was like, oh shit, okay, so I'm really, like, yes, I believe there's a real world, you know what I mean? I'm not saying there's not something there, but I realized I don't experience it directly. Yeah. In fact, it's the same with the book. You know, two people can read the same book and have a different experience. Two people can be in the same room and experience something entirely different.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, reality itself is subjective, right? Because we can't, I guess that's what science is about, right? Trying to remove the subjectivity from experience. And it's useful as a tool in that way. This is, you know, another thing Jordan Peterson often talks about. But it also separates the most important part of experience, right? Phenomenological experience from life, you know? So it's like a useful tool, but when it becomes a foundation for your understanding of reality, then it falls short, I think.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I agree.
yeah, I think that's why you know, you're talking about, you know, shaman and rituals, and every culture worldwide, I mean, even our culture to kind of a smaller degree has initiation rituals, like basic training, which I went through when I was in the Air Force. You know, it's an initiation ritual, and there's less mysticism about it than there used to be, but it's the same thing. You know, it's like the same pattern, right, of taking young people, usually men, and removing them from, you know, the safety of home and the mother, and exposing them to something outside of their reality. And it's always had a magical kind of a tinge to it. And I think that when you talk about it in those terms, that's actually more useful because it makes more sense when you think about it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think everyone also has a magical part of their brain, and everyone has to worship something. It's not that the people who are non-religious and non-magical no longer worship. It's
Right.
They think they don't worship, so you fall into worshiping something like subconsciously, whether you mean to or not. And
Yeah.
fuck, I think maybe it was David Foster Wallace who said, like, and if you worship the wrong thing, that will like devour you. So for instance, if you have no greater belief and your essential worship is material goods, is finance, for you, that's all the meaning in the world. You will never have enough.
Yeah.
Like if what you worship is money, it doesn't matter how rich you are, you'll never have enough. If what you worship is your own physical appearance, that you've got to be beautiful and sexy and all of that, you'll never be beautiful enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
However, if you put that worship towards the right thing, something divine, it doesn't devour you the same way that the smaller things do. And we all fall into some form of magical thinking, like routine and ritual aren't that different. And people who have just basic superstitions or unfounded fears, or that's all magical thinking. Even ridiculousness, like racism. Like if I had a different mindset with you, it would totally transform what you are to me. You know what I mean?
No, I'd be something different to you.
Is magic. Yeah, it would transform you, and a racist person wouldn't be able to see what I see. It'd be the equivalent of I'm seeing a unicorn and they're saying that's just a horse with no horn.
Sure. Yeah.
And actually, I found looking back, because for me, very young, I just fell into loving comic books instantly. Like when I could barely read at 4, I was still wanting comics and mostly looking at the pictures. Looking back on it, I think it was like an internal hunger for a pantheon of gods.
Yeah. Yes.
I think comic book superheroes took that place of the pantheon. And for me, when I was young, school was less important than comic books. And as a child, like I hooked onto Marvel. So even though I love Swamp Thing, I love Batman, I hooked on the Marvel universe. And when I was growing up, comic books were on every newsstand. They were sold at the grocery store, and they were sold at the corner store. And so I was always grabbing new issues. And to me, the Marvel universe was more important than the real world, like emotionally. I didn't give a shit to learn about history and geography. But I was super excited to get a new issue that explained more. The history of the Marvel universe felt more real to me as a child.
Yeah, no, that's a very similar story to my experience as well. I was exactly the same. Like, and I was a big Marvel guy too. Like, I liked some DC stuff, but I was Marvel all the way. Spider-Man especially was like my icon, you know, my idol in my youth. But I was interested. Go ahead.
I was gonna say I love Spider-Man, but the one I hooked on was Wolverine and the X-Men.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna ask you actually, and I'll get to that in a second. I wanted to ask you about the characters that you resonated most with. But it's surprising you mentioned the thing about having a pantheon, right, and it being related to mythology. Because when I started reading, some of the first things I was reading were like at a babysitter's house, like biblical stories in like a kid's book, which I thought were fascinating. And I never was a religious kid. I never even got religious as I got older. But I was always fascinated by those stories because they were the first ones I was introduced to. And then there were also books of mythology, and I got huge into Greek mythology. Because it's exactly the same thing, right? It's this pantheon of characters who have abilities beyond and above what we have, but who suffer from and struggle with the same, you know, emotions and needs pulling him in different directions. And watching that happen, like watching that unfold, I mean, it's an allegory, right, for life. So you get to see how these characters who are far more capable than you are deal with that kind of thing, and when they fall short and how they fall short. It's a lesson, I think. That's like the power of fiction. I think kids are all drawn to it, you know.
Yeah, and I think Marvel was particularly good at that aspect of giving the characters those very relatable human problems as opposed to DC. Like the way Spider-Man's not only worrying about fighting the Vulture, but he's got to get the medicine back to Aunt May.
Yeah,
Before, up from her nap. He's got these little mundane things. He's got homework. He's got to worry about, paying some bill and getting.
He's got a bully at school. He's like,
and he's got a bully at school. Or when you look at the X-Men, they all have their different issues. The way Rogue can't touch people and has that loneliness issue. The way she's absorbed Carol Danvers and has a split psyche.
Yeah.
The way Wolverine has his rage issues. He has his uncontrollable anger problem. He's got his antisocial tendencies. He's got his loss of past. The way Nightcrawler felt like an outsider and a freak.
Well, look at the Hulk too. I mean, I know the X-Men is your thing, but the Hulk has that same kind of dichotomy. It's the Jekyll and Hyde. It's like the hostile brothers in one person. Like fighting at war with himself. Those themes are so deep in those stories. They're great.
And how, before we jump any further into this, because I haven't checked into the character arc yet. How does this tie into what you're doing with the character arc?
Yeah, so it ties in very directly for me. As far as the business side of things goes, not much. This is just, comic books have been a personal interest of mine. And I think that the exploration of fiction, like any kind of fiction, whatever you resonate with, has, let's say, I think infinite value. I think there's no end to how deep you can explore what you're getting out of fiction. And so comic books are a form of fiction, obviously. And they occupy a really weird, unique space in fiction. You have books where you have to use your imagination to visualize everything, but the author is painting that picture for you very vividly. And you have movies where it's all kind of just force-fed to you. And I love movies, so I'm not talking bad about movies. But with comics, you have, the visual and the words together, and you have to kind of fill in the gaps. So there's it's a creative process that you're engaged in. And I think that draws kids, right? Because you get something to work with, but then you get to play with it, right? Because you see Spider-Man in a freeze frame, but then you get to imagine how he gets to the next one. And it's like activating a certain part of you that draws you into the story in a way that some other things don't as much. But for the character arc, what I do with people is that I walk them through a process that I call smart streaming. And I say smart streaming because, it's alliterative, people like that, but also because, you watch movies, most of the time it's passive, it's just entertainment. But I think that fiction is meant to be absorbed actively. Like you said, mythology, it was very serious for people. Religion is very serious for people. It wasn't just entertainment. And I think that the fiction that we enjoy, because it plays that same role in our lives, can have the same effect if we really look at it. And so with comics, I'm looking at the characters I care about. I say, why do I care so much about Spider-Man? Like, what is it about that character that touches me in a deep way, right? And about that character's experience, the stories told around him. And what I realize is that there's some kernel of my value system embedded in that character, right? It's like something that I respect about a way of being, about a way of operating in the world is embodied by that character to such a degree that I want to emulate them. And so long story short, the character arc uses that same feeling of resonance, more with movies because movies are short and you can watch one in an hour and a half and kind of do the exploration very quickly. Although I use it for everything that I consume. But using that resonance with whatever situation or character feels relevant to you and saying, okay, this is not just, I'm not tearing up because I'm feeling emotional right now. I'm not tearing up because the story is so good. It's like something's happening inside of me. What is that? And so that's kind of the underlying foundation of the character arc, like an exploration of that idea.
That's excellent. Because I think that's incredibly powerful. And I think that is magic. Like the way we respond to things. And on the other end, from the end of the creators, from what I've heard, or just from my own experience as an artist, is you don't fully know where it all comes from either. So the same way with you, that you've got this internal experience that you don't control, like it happens when you read the story. Like for one good example, the character Silver Surfer that Jack Kirby first developed, and then, you know, him and Stan Lee put together. Like Silver Surfer first appeared in Fantastic Four, and then when they went to give him his own series the first time, they'd planned out the story arc where Silver Surfer's trapped on Earth and he doesn't want to be here, and he's his typical sort of like poetic self that just wants to get away from all the shitty stuff on Earth. But the way the story was planned to go was that humanity was going to keep being so shitty to the Silver Surfer that eventually he would turn on us and attack. And I've got like the original series. It only goes up to like 20 issues or something, because he wrote the issue where Silver Surfer is finally pissed off at humanity, and it finishes with him saying, like, you want violence? I'll show you violence. You want, you know, this is what you want, you know, conflict and hate. I'll be the most powerful villain you've ever faced. And it says next week, you know, come, or in 2 weeks, come see what happens. And Stan Lee said he couldn't write it past that. And he said that was the first time he had promised an issue and cut it short. Like he had stopped other series before, but planning it. This time he found he just couldn't do it. And he said that the character just wouldn't do it. That when he tried to write the next issue, he was like, no, the Silver Surfer just would not be a villain. And he realized he was trying to put that onto the character because it was interesting from like his monkey mind. But that inspiration part, the muse, was like, fuck off, Stan, you're not turning him into a villain. And so it just stopped dead with no explanation. And then Silver Surfer restarted 15 years later, back with the character as if he'd never been momentarily turning evil. And like Alan Moore's very open about using magic to get ideas, but even like Stephen King says that he feels rather than inventing the story, he feels like he discovers it. Like the story is somehow there, and that the one like his first idea sort of connects him to it. And then it's like he's brushing away the fog to find what is actually there.
You know, that's kind of like what sculptors say, where they say like there's a piece of marble and there's something inside of it that they have to get at. You know, they have to chip away till they actually reach it. I was actually like not a huge surfer fan when I was younger, although he's grown on me as I've gotten older, especially because I guess when I was younger, I didn't connect to the cosmic stories because they were so big. The era when I started reading comics was kind of like the Jim Starlin, Ron Lim era, where they were having all these Thanos. It was like kind of Infinity Crisis era. And so I was like, it was a little too grandiose. I like my street level heroes like Spider-Man. But I think that, you know, I had an issue of Silver Surfer #3, actually, where he's kind of in a duel with Mephisto. And there's like this, it's a really great issue, and it kind of goes through his story, which they used to do like every time. He's got, you know, Zenla and Shalabal waiting for him, and this like deep anguish on the inside. And like I connected with that a little bit. It was almost like a Superman backstory to a degree, right? Because he comes from this world that he can't go back to, and a new world where he's always an alien and foreigner, but ramped up to 11. So he was a really cool character,
Yeah, and when I was young, Silver Surfer was a character I very much liked, and I was buying them off the newsstand. And actually, my one major complaint about the Infinity series, like the Avengers movies, is that they left Silver Surfer out. Like Thanos and the Infinity Gauntlet started in Silver Surfer around the issues 40. And before it was the big crossover event that bled out into every other Marvel comic in the newsstand, it was a Silver Surfer plot line on its own for a while. And I can't believe they left that out. But for me, when I was young, the X-Men were like my heart. Like that was what I loved the most. And Silver Surfer was oddly detached from everyone else. He rarely interacted with the X-Men. I did like him on his own. But I find now as an adult, as much as I still love the X-Men and Wolverine, the older I've gotten, the more I like Silver Surfer. And I would say out of Marvel, Silver Surfer is probably my favorite character now. And definitely with Silver Surfer, it's not like with the X-Men, I realize I'm projecting the Pantheon idea. Like I'm feeling that it serves as a pantheon. of gods, the way the X-Men are formed. But with Silver Surfer, for Jack Kirby, it was outright. He saw like Galactus was a stand-in for God. Mm-hmm. And he saw the Silver Surfer as like an angel, sort of a god and an angel archetype. But I find more of his wording of an angel, of all the superheroes, to me, Silver Surfer is basically the Jesus of the Marvel universe. It's his world was threatened. He went and offered to give himself up to God, total service to God for the sake of his entire race, that he sacrificed life and his being. And I find the older I get, the more I love Silver Surfer. Although also, the older I've gotten, I turned into sort of a hermit as well. When I was a kid, you know, I was more active with friends and with the world. I really identify with Silver Surfer's desire just to drift in deep space away from all the nonsense.
The Hulk had that too, with his, you know, just wants to be left alone type deal.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I thought when you were talking earlier about, you know, how the artists themselves feel like they're a conduit, or like they're bringing something, they're like, you know, pulling something out of the ether, which is really true on some level, right? Because a lot of the collective unconscious, you know, is down there. It's like not something that we have direct access to, but these artistic people, they can just tap into it and tell these stories that have like such deep meanings that even they may not be familiar with. And I was reading this book by Northrop Frye, and he was talking about, he was, you know, kind of the inventor of modern criticism. And he was talking about critique as having relevance, but not based on taste. And he was saying that, you know, that means that it extends beyond the creator, because if you ask a creator, he used Shakespeare as an example. If you ask Shakespeare, you know, about his works and tell him to explain why his works are so revolutionary, he would not give you a great answer. You know, he would tell you what he thought when he was making it. He probably was a really out there, eccentric, weird guy. He wouldn't tell you anything like what, you know, a literature professor will tell you, or what a philosopher will tell you, or a psychologist will tell you, because his works were deeper than he himself knew. And you see that in stories all the time. And I think it's so useful because it lets us recognize how important this, you know, how useful the stories can be to us, separate from the creator of them. You know, like it doesn't have to be tied to the creator and everything that all the issues you might have with them, which a lot of people try to do nowadays. You know, like we have to cancel someone if they had a problem in their personal life, or they were, you know, they happen to be a racist or something, right? Or they happen to be someone who did terrible things. We can't appreciate their art because somehow they're tied together with it. And I don't think that's the case. I think that financial support for that kind of thing is not good, obviously. But if you're just trying to get the ideas and like the creative products of people, I think that those stand on an even footing wherever they are. But you said something else I wanted to touch on real quick, which was you talked about the idea of the X-Men and like their status as outsiders. I mean, when they first started, I thought it was really interesting because they were kind of an allegory for the civil rights movement, right? Like all their issues, them as mutants, were like them being different. And so you had the Magneto, who was kind of like, I think he was conceived of as kind of like on the Malcolm X side of the spectrum, where he's saying, okay, no one's going to accept us, so we have to just crush everyone. And then you had like the Professor X, who was kind of the Martin Luther King character. And the clash between those characters, which, you know, was started in the 60s, was like an allegory for the clash of civilization in that way. I think comics have always been so great at doing that, like taking these social issues, turning them into something that's palatable and explorable, that doesn't necessarily trigger people, but that's useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially once you move something into a fictional realm like that, you can play with ideas without it hitting people's ego and like directly, like the way we all kind of like to believe we live in the real world. And whatever our beliefs about the world are should be universally accepted. So if you write a story about the real world, someone will react with, no, that's not the way things are inside. Whereas you set it somewhere fictional and you make just one thing a metaphor,
right? And
suddenly they can absorb the message on a whole different level.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting, again, how like the idea of sort of one screen, two movies, or, you know, one book, two stories, we can see different things. Where did you grow up and how old are you? Like,
so I'm 37, and I grew up in New York. I was born in Pennsylvania, but I grew up in Harlem and then Mount Vernon after that. So I spent most of my young life there.
Of course you love fucking Spider-Man. So And for me, New York, like what you see so much in the Marvel comics,
Yeah.
nothing like the world outside my window.
Right.
And it wasn't until I was in my 20s, when I was working with Trauma Films, I went down to visit New York for the first time in my life. And when I went to New York, I was like, holy shit, it's like the Marvel comics. There's water towers. Like in Canada, I've never seen those water towers on top of buildings.
Yeah, like I thought they were there just there to be destroyed by supervillains. I didn't realize they were like a real thing.
Yeah, and or even just the scale of New York and the flagpoles and everything.
Yeah.
It blew my mind, because to me, that world Spider-Man lived in would have, for me, been more fictional than it would have.
Right.
And I'm 41, so we're about the same age. So we grew up with the same. But also for me, growing up in Canada and the way I did, I didn't see that civil rights aspect to the X-Men didn't stand out to me.
Yeah.
For me, the X-Men are a fantastic metaphor for insanity, for madness, and a dangerous gift. Like, it gives you abilities others don't have, but it's very easy to destroy yourself.
Yes.
And have you seen the ad for the Watchmen TV show?
I have. I've seen one of them. Yeah, one of the trailers.
Okay, so did you watch any any reviews or anything, or have you just seen one of the trailers?
Not too much. I saw one of the trailers. I read a few articles. I like Damon Lindelof in general, so seeing him attached was like, I'm a little scared, but I'm gonna give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm gonna watch it. We'll see how he does.
So when you watched the trailer though, and you saw that group of people in the Rorschach masks, what did you think that group was right away?
I did not think anything, but now that you say that, I'm thinking like Antifa or something.
Well, I watched it, and then after heard a review, and someone said how the Rorschach group are white supremacists. And in my mind, it was like these guys in ski masks had some sort of group, and they attacked a family at one point. Yeah. But when you see them bust into that woman's family's house, I didn't assume it had anything to do with race whatsoever. I assumed something plot-wise. But then after every other review I heard, it seemed to everyone else it was obvious they were white supremacists. And when I first heard someone say that, I went, oh, for fuck's sakes, they better not have made Rorschach's symbol into white supremacy. And I ran back and looked at the trailer. More slowly, I was like, fuck, every one of those guys is white under those masks.
Well, here's the thing, though.
I didn't see a group of white guys attacking a black family. I saw a group of Rorschach masks, which could have been anything. Yeah, like they could have been some sort of Antifa or Proud Boys thing.
Sure.
Like relative to fighting good and evil.
Yeah.
Not that there was some racial element to it. Whereas it seems to many other people immediately saw that that was going to be talking about a racial divide.
But I think that's kind of more of a sign of the times. I got to go back and check it out, and maybe it'll have that. There are a lot of stories where you can map on some kind of social issue to what's being played out. You know. Now there's also times when it's being explicitly inserted into the story for that reason, and I'm sometimes it's hard to draw the difference between the two. But when I saw it, I didn't think that at all either. I didn't have that initial thought. But I think nowadays people's tendency is to immediately start slotting the stories into the ideological place that they fit. And so there may be some truth to it. Again, like I said, I have to see it, but I think people tend to start looking too deeply into things too early. Like the show's not even out yet. I want to wait until it comes out. Maybe we'll find out what is actually going on. But I think that's just a tendency that people have nowadays to immediately try to ascribe, their position to its reflection. It's like it's a resonance, right? So you're seeing in the fiction what you're seeing because of you. So you're not necessarily even seeing the fiction. You're seeing something that's a reflection.
Although, unless I'm wrong, if we go back to the X-Men and your analogy of Professor X and Magneto as being Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, that one I think you're right on. And
that was explicit.
Stan Lee thought that way himself.
Yeah, it was. That was actually pretty explicit. Like he said that before, and it's pretty like established as what the story was meant to be created as an allegory for. So that's not just my interpretation, but you see what I mean, right? There's other stories that probably weren't built around that same structure, that have that similar structure, and I could say the same thing about those. But that would be me.
Yeah, and so for me, though, I missed that element of it as a kid. I understand it now about the X-Men, but I missed it as a kid because my environment didn't have that racial tension anywhere growing up. Like,
Sure.
my first best friend, where we met when we were like 3 or 2.5, you know, so very young, he had just moved from Thailand. And so when I met him, he didn't speak English either. My first friend, we played, and I loved playing. Like, we connected really strongly with no ability to communicate at first. We would have his mom come translate, but most of our play time was the equivalent, like me just talking in a language he can't understand, blah, 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 and showing him like toys from Canada. And then he was like, blah, 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 and showing me his toys from Thailand. And there was nothing, like, I was brought up with that idea of sort of, like, that idea past the civil rights movement of, okay, people are equal. And in fact, when I was really young, I remember wanting to be black only because you didn't sunburn as easily. And I was so blonde, I sunburned so badly, but I had no concept of any other difference. To me, it was like, if the only difference is skin color, and your skin color doesn't burn as easy, it'd be wonderful. Now, it's so naive compared to other environments.
Sure.
Because that wasn't there for me, I didn't see that racial element at all. And I, as a kid, like, I never fit in. I was always weird, but I could act fairly normal. I just didn't want to. So I identified with the X-Men as the weirdos, but then especially after going insane and moving on to do magic, which is basically like trying to turn insanity into a superpower in the ways of the old shaman and looking at it as a dangerous gift. To me, despite Stan Lee's intentions, it just comes across as a story that's a metaphor for insanity to me.
It's a metaphor for a lot of things. I think all those interpretations are correct. Like I said, like that quote I was talking about, you know, when the
multi-dimensional
creator doesn't get to decide what the interpretation is. That's just, you know, they don't get to do that. It's something that artists have to let go of.
But it's even that way with basic elements of nature. Like, what is corn? To one person, corn's a food. To another person, it's a decoration.
Right. Yeah.
You know, to someone else, it's garbage because they don't eat it. To someone else, it's fuel because you've got a corn stove too.
Yeah. Well, you know,
reality is much more multi-dimensional.
Yeah. Well, that's what you're saying about, you know, your position determines what you see, you know, so reality, sure, there's some objectivity to reality, obviously, but we see very little of it. You know, what we see is always tinged by our personal lens on the world. So,
but also if you look close enough,
the reality,
objectivity breaks down.
Yeah.
Like the Silver Surfer toy is an object at this size, but zoom down and it's electrons and empty space. And an electron isn't an object. So again, it's multidimensional. It's only from here and at this scale that's an object. At a different scale, it's energy, probability waves of electron placement. And I do think fiction is like that as well. And I think there's something to that idea of the muse, of the gods handing down stories, of angels whispering in people's ears. And that something sort of fractal and holographic and multidimensional is going on here where, like, that the angel that whispered in Stan Lee's ear or Shakespeare's was aware of every meaning everyone needed to get out of it somehow at that time. And it might be why something just, like, I don't know why I have to make this guy, you know, have a lion with him and it can't be a tiger. I don't know. I just feel, but yeah, I feel like there's something.
Well, I mean, you're describing, it seems like one aspect of Jung talking about the collective unconscious, right? That's what it is. It's like the stored history, not just stored in our minds, right? In our learnings from culture, but also biologically it's stored. Like, we're a creature that does things a certain way. And our culture is built around us doing things that way. And so all of our stories are, of course, also built around doing things in that way. And that pattern reemerges. And that's why you see the same kind of stories emerge all over the world, different cultures, obviously not the X-Men, but like, the different types of stories, the pattern of stories seems to hold consistently as you look around the world. And that's because it's just something about us. We tell stories like this. And I actually think that, so I didn't actually see the racial element to the X-Men story at all either. I just thought they were dope mutants, hanging out and running around, like having fights with the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. But I didn't realize that that was a thing until I read about it later. But then when I saw it, it was pretty apparent. But I think that this is an important piece also, and this ties into the character arc a little bit. When you look at ideology, right, like no matter what it drives people to do, right, you can be stuck in a way of looking at the world that's completely non-productive. You can be the most nihilistic, most vengeful, like hateful person, and you can feel that to your core. And I have, and that's an experience I've had myself. So I'm not saying it from the outside. I'm saying it from the inside. But it doesn't matter. Even when you're in that state, when you look at stories, you always know who to admire. You always know who's the villain also. And then even when you try to like kind of sell yourself on the whole, Thanos was right kind of mentality that some people do try to talk themselves into, it's very clear to everyone that he's the bad guy. And actually just the last episode of my podcast, I was talking about villains and how there's a lot of overlap between things villains typically say and things that I hear people say in the real world. And drawing attention to those things, I think, is useful because it creates that cognitive dissonance where when you start to say villainous things or start to think villainous thoughts, you're aware of it. And I think that awareness, like that awareness of fiction, like looking at fiction as if it has something deeper to say, has all types of benefits that leak into your life, like in ways that are not even part of the structure that I teach, but just in naturalistic ways that happen automatically when you read a good story and really respond to it.
And so what kinds of things have you noticed people saying on a regular basis that villains say?
Well, so I mean, the podcast, I can use the examples I used in the podcast. I'll give you one. People who talk about having children as being like a burden on the planet. That's like a big, having children is like the worst that you can do in the world. How could you bring life into the world? That's like a Mr. Smith from The Matrix kind of an argument. The one big one that I noticed a lot.
Or it's a very Thanos argument that we're
they're the same argument. Yeah. And well, here's the thing. So both Thanos and Mr. Smith both have lines in their movies where they talk about the same thing. And this is a typical villainy trigger. As soon as you hear someone talking like this in a movie, they're the bad guy. Yeah, it's inevitability. So Thanos' big quote is like, "I am inevitable." Mr. Smith has that scene where he's holding Neo in front of the train. He's like, that is the sound of inevitability. They talk about things as if there's a determinism to the world. Things are going to go the way that we've predicted. Therefore, we have to take action to prevent it in whatever manner we need to. It says like, I know how things work. I have the final answers. It's a very totalitarian mindset. It says everything's determined. There's no free will. It's, what it is? It's the anti-life equation in, Darkseid's anti-life equation. It's the same thing. The anti-life equation, on Apocalypse is basically the mathematical proof that there is no free will and that hope is futile. And it's kind of the way that Darkseid and like all of his compatriots often try to take over the world because it turns people into like zombies, deterministic zombies. And that idea is the same as the idea of inevitability.
Now, I myself am not certain we have free will at all. I completely understand Sam Harris's point.
Yeah.
I understand, and Sam Harris even recently had one podcast where he was talking about how when you really examine free will, and if you come to the conclusion he's come to, which I totally understand when he says he doesn't experience free will anymore.
Sure.
The closer I look, the less I can find any fucking free will in myself. Now, I like Tim Freak's word paralogical. I'm good with paralogical now that I'm insane. So I think somehow the lack of free will might map to reality and be 100% true.
Yeah.
Yet somehow there's also free will, but we're talking about now something on a level of understanding we don't have. And if there's free will, I don't know what it is. So for myself, actually, as something practical, what I found really helpful is I use now as the dividing line for those subpersonalities or those beliefs. Everything in the past, and it's been 7 or 8 years I've been living by this. So at first it was I had to force it, now it comes naturally. everything in the past had to be exactly the way it was. Nobody had any free will. You know, it's all there, but for the grace of God went I.
Yeah.
So if I'm looking to judge someone else, they were born into that situation. It's all a product of your genetic and spiritual inheritance, what you come in with, and your environment. No free will whatsoever. Yet from here forward, I imagine we all have some limited free will. So
Sure.
I'm trying to plan something for next year. I treat myself like I have free will. But next year, when I look back, I look at it like I never had free will the whole way. It just played out.
It just played out, yeah. Yeah, well, if you can hold those two things together at the same time, then and that seems to work, because that is how the world seems to lay itself out for us. I've talked the free will conversation back and forth with people, and I think a lot of times I get bored with it, because I don't think at the end of the day it's important. I think that it's more of like one of those, it's a philosophical conversation without an end. It's like a self-licking ice cream cone. I think that the important piece is kind of what, and Jordan Peterson's put this very, very nicely, I think, which is to say that we treat other people like they have free will, and we get very angry if they don't treat us that way too. So whether we have free will in a cosmic sense, or in, like the atoms of our bodies, if that's deterministic, I feel like it doesn't necessarily matter to our conscious experience. And so I don't really get into it too much, but I do see where you're coming from. The logic behind it is pretty flawless, as is all of the logic behind rational and often evil ideas.
Now, although, because Peterson will say that, try treating someone like they don't have free will and see what happens. Or he'll say, yeah, try to design a society around no free will. But as opposed to that ending the conversation, I think there's a great conversation to be had there, because also try treating someone like they always had total free will. They won't like that either.
Yeah.
Should have done that differently. You were entirely capable of choosing differently.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do like being treated like, you know what? I see you did your best. Given the information you were given, it's understandable you would have made that mistake. We enjoy being treated. In fact, I think Peterson's wrong. We enjoy being treated like there's a mix of free will and not. We don't like being held accountable for everything.
We certainly don't like it. I'll give you that. That's true.
And maybe it comes to what Alan Watts says about how what we want is not to be in control of anything, absolutely, but to have some control. He's like, the thrill of driving a fast car is you're sort of in control, but not completely. As soon as you hit a gust of wind or the ice, and he says, it's the same way with your partner or your children. You don't want them absolutely under your control. What you say is what you do. You want some control over your partner. You want them to care about what you care about. But you also want a certain amount of unpredictability. A video game is fun because you have some control, but not total.
Yeah.
And reality, I think, is made up of some weird mixture of no control and control. That just
I would agree with you. Yeah. I mean, I don't feel like that's very controversial. I agree with that. I think a friend of mine had a good way of thinking of it that was kind of similar to what you said. He thinks of it as like, we're like marionettes, right? We're on strings. And we have no ability to control it, but we do have a direct line, if we use it, to the puppeteer. Like we can influence things, right? We can't control them, but we can influence to some degree. And that seems to be like that's pretty much what you were saying, right? There's some level of control, but there's not obviously absolute control. I mean, you can't just make the stuff, you're not the Silver Surfer, right? You can't use the power cosmic to make the world into what you want it to be. But
even then, because if you come down to Dr. Manhattan, he can do anything with his mind. Yet he says he has no choice whatsoever. He's just as much a puppet as everyone else. The only difference is he sees the strings.
Yeah. See, speaking of which, I wanted to take a step backwards into the comic book world really quick, because one of the comics we didn't talk about that's probably my favorite of all the Alan Moore works is Miracle Man. And
I haven't read Miracle Man yet.
Oh, okay. Well, so when you talked about the Silver Surfer, right, and him running up against that dilemma of figuring that, the world and humanity were so cruel to him that he said, screw it, like, I'm going to be the bad guy if you want me to be the bad guy, That story is basically kind of like, that is explored very deeply in Miracle Man, which, if you haven't read it, it's phenomenal. It goes for about 30 issues, and then Neil Gaiman did like 10 more issues after Alan Moore stopped writing it. But
Okay.
his character, who was Marvel Man in the old days, he was basically like Shazam. You know, he was like Captain Marvel. He had magical powers. He'd say a magic word, Kimota, which is atomic backwards, and he would turn into this Marvel Man. And of course, Alan Moore, just like he did with Swamp Thing, said, okay, I'm taking this character and doing whatever I want with him. He's not going to be a campy magic hero with like his Miracle Man family anymore. He's going to become like this dark, this, you know, dystopian kind of version of himself through the course of the story. And he basically writes a story in which the premise is Superman is real, but he has all these amazing powers. Eventually, he's going to start making decisions. He just walks you through the process of like that person becoming a despot, even if they're like a net positive, like he makes the world much better, but at what cost? And he explores that exact idea. I think it's brilliant. And it's, I don't want to spoil anything for you, so I won't go into it too much, but if you get a chance, really, you should check it out. It's like my favorite, I think, of all of, maybe From Hell and that are probably my two favorite Alan Moore works.
Yeah, I haven't read From Hell yet either. And those are definitely ones I want to. Well, yeah, I want to read everything he's written.
Okay.
But yeah,
I'd love to talk to you about it after you read them.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I do know From Hell, like, have you seen the Mindscape of Alan Moore, that documentary about him?
No, I didn't.
So in that documentary, he explains how in writing From Hell really changed his thinking on the metaphysical. Like, he was just trying to write a good comic, and in one panel, he had one character say to another, the one place in which gods and demons inarguably exist is in the minds of men, where they are real in all their grandeur and monstrosity. He said he wrote it and thought, okay, that's a great line. It's the right size to fit in the panel. It follows in. It sounds great. He said he moved to write the next panel, and then he thought, wait a minute. I think that was true. He went back to what he wrote. He was like, he said, like, in writing that line in From Hell, it just suddenly made him realize the truth of that statement.
Yeah.
And that was the seed in many ways for him becoming a magician.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I gotta watch that documentary. I never saw it.
Fantastic. The Mindscape of Alan Moore. It starts, he describes his early life at the beginning, and then he talks to getting into comic writing, and then describes all his moving into ceremonial magic.
Yeah. I'll check it out
on YouTube. It's excellent.
Okay.
Watch it.
Nice. Well, I guess okay, that was my slight divergence. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss that Miracle Man plug, because I recommend that to everyone when I talk to them. You know, even amongst comic book people, there are a lot of people who haven't read Miracle Man, so it's like one of those ones I can always tell people about that gets a lot of attention, and that people really enjoy when they do read it.
Is it collected into a graphic novel, or do you have to?
Yeah, I see it in trades sometimes. It's definitely in graphic novel form. I think it might be one volume. It wasn't a very long series, but a lot was packed into it. Well, I would say, I guess, so now I'm taking another right turn, kind of back into the free will thing, but more as like a practical concern, right? So what I do for a living is to help people to make transitions, right? And so the implication there has to be that you have not only some control, but like ultimate control over your situation. And so regardless of the metaphysics of the universe, right, I think that acting that way, acting as if that's true, does make people's lives better. I've seen it happen. And I think you guys see it happen too with your channel. You know, the people who are sorting themselves out are taking some control. Now, maybe that was going to happen no matter what, but it is happening. And so we can always point to that and say, like, that is something that is indicative of the fact that we should be trying, at least. Because I think the problem with the idea of not having free will is that if you think that way for too long, you do believe it, you know, in a certain sense. Like, I don't think we can separate the part of our brain that knows the truth of reality and then can act in some contrary way on the other end, you know? Does that make sense?
Yeah, although I think to fall into believing there's no free will, you have to spend a lot of time meditating and observing yourself, and you have to get so deep into yourself that you connect to some soul level shit, even if you don't believe in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's possible to sink into that and to feel like, okay, I see I have no free will, and I see that this is all meaningful, And I have no choice but to act out the best I can conceive of. So for instance, I think everything I'm doing with the channel is good.
Yeah.
We were looking at it from free will. It would be good to apply my free will to doing this. Yet when I look back on it, I appear to have been helpless and fallen into, especially because when it comes right down to it, the way this all started was my fucking archangel told me to message Andrew that he would want to talk to me. And so it started with me listening to an imaginary character, well, possibly physically real, but I'm fine with calling it, possibly metaphysically real. But even if an imaginary angel whispered in my ear to reach out to Andrew, and it led to all that. And when I look back, I was helpless to take it because it was asked of me by people I care about, and it is in my nature to do what I can to work towards good, and I was able to do it. Now, if I was asked to do something else I'm not able to do, I wouldn't do it. But looking back, I'm not sure I had any free will.
Yeah. Well, I think you're self short. You obviously not only heard that call, but answered it. And that was you doing that. So, I mean, I think what you guys are doing is fantastic. And so even if you won't give yourself, if you say it's deterministic, that's fine. But I'm saying it was you. So
paralogically, I think it was both deterministic and free will in a way that's impossible to explain.
Well, the universe is a very strange place. So
yeah, the universe is so fucking weird. And, if there is a God and whatever God is, fuck, he's a weirdo. Or she, or it, or they.
Yeah.
This is such a strange place. But to jump right back to the beginning now, so we don't get too far off topic.
Sure.
What first made, do you remember first falling in love with Spider-Man? Like, if that was your first favorite, do you remember the moment you first experienced that, holy shit, Spider-Man's important?
It was so early in my life that I don't know if I can remember the exact moment, but I remember the time period. And so I was in New York, and I was, 10 years old, maybe even younger. And I had actually gotten into my first visual medium, like comic form, was manga. So my mom took a trip to Japan to visit my aunt who was there at the time, and she brought back some Dragon Ball Z manga in Japanese. They leave it tied in bundles, on the street for pickup, like newspaper. And so she brought some back for me. And I remember thinking, whoa, this is awesome. It's cool art. I always like to draw. So I was like, oh, this is really cool art. And I don't know what they're talking about, but it looks interesting. But soon after that, I discovered, comic books and really started getting into them. And there was this moment I remember, especially being in New York and being younger, so I was younger than Peter Parker, who was kind of in his 30s in the 90s. But I remember seeing what it was? It was a combination of the physical attributes, because there's something about Spider-Man. He's so embodied as a hero, right? Like the freedom that he has to do things in the world is exhibited through his movement. Other characters have a strong physical presence. Like Wolverine there's a very strong sense of presence for Wolverine. You know how he moves, but you really know how Spider-Man moves. And for me, that was just the coolest possible thing ever. It was this ultimate
Spider-Man's freedom of motion compared to
exactly
all over. His movement is just so vast, and his ability. Right. Also, he's so unique in that he doesn't just fly, or he's not just running around. That ebb dynamic makes him such a unique character for mobility.
Yes, and it's the constraint too, right? Because he doesn't have infinite power. He's not Superman. He can't fly around. He's finite, but what he does with that finitude is almost infinite. He's a very meta character in that way, and that aspect appealed to me. And the other piece that really appealed to me was the idea of and this is interesting, it didn't really hit me until I was an adult. I'd loved Spider-Man for 20 years at that point, but the great power, great responsibility distinction, that lesson that he learned, that harsh lesson. It was all the power in the world doesn't mean anything if you don't do something with it. You have a responsibility to do that. And I always thought that always impacted me, even when I wasn't acting in accordance with that, even when I didn't like that idea, it was something that really stuck with me always. And with a lot of people too. I'm not unique in this, obviously. Spider-Man's probably everybody's favorite hero. Not everybody, but many people. And you see kids, I was walking down the street the other day, I saw a kid with a Spider-Man t-shirt on. And I used to have all the Spider-Man paraphernalia that one could own, that we could afford. And I was just, in love with the whole idea. But I realized what that is and this is something else Jordan Peterson talks about often, which is like identification with the hero, right? Identification with the process that creates order out of chaos. And like, why do you wear a t-shirt with a character on it? Like, you know, why do you dress up like a character for a Halloween party? Like, why would you do that? It doesn't make sense outside of a framework where you understand that some part of you is drawn to emulate your heroes. And so for me, that emulation was like physical. I always wanted to do gymnastics and martial arts and stuff because I just wanted to be able to move that way. That freedom really of movement attracted me. But it was also something about just being a forthright person. You know, the fact there's a scene, I use it for my Instagram account. There's the scene in one of the early books, I can't remember the issue, where Spider-Man is trapped under the machinery and he has to kind of muster all of his will to lift it. It's a really iconic scene. And he pushes it back and he yells, "I'm free." And like that is like that's like in a nutshell, all that I think about. That's what Spider-Man is to me. And that's why it attracted me so much.
For me, I can still remember, and I was much, much younger because it was before I could like fully read the comic. But just off the newsstand, I already knew who Spider-Man was, and I knew who the Avengers were. But my first time encountering the X-Men was I just picked up at the grocery store or whatever an issue of Secret Wars.
Oh.
So it's all the heroes, and Wolverine had such a small part. But for some, and like I didn't even know what his fucking powers were in particular. But something about the image of Wolverine, instantly I was hooked on that character. And from Secret Wars, I sought out X-Men and just fell so hard into that world. Although
that's awesome.
X-Men, while in the comics they're the outsiders, I found that also mirrored reality. Because for me, it was the 80s, and Spider-Man had all, you know, Spider-Man was famous, was part of culture. Captain America was part of culture. But the X-Men were not part of culture, or at least where I was in the 80s. There hadn't been any cartoons yet. There hadn't been any shows.
Was it Alpha Flight up there?
No, Alpha Flight was not universally known either. Although it ties in with the X-Men, like Wolverine knows the Hudsons, you know, they're part of his story. So to me, Alpha Flight tied into the X-Men side. But it was like, I was always reading comics in the school bus, and like I always had comics with me. If I had Spider-Man or had other things, people knew what it was. But when I had X-Men comics, what I was used to hearing from both adults and kids who weren't into comics were, what is that? Nobody knew who the X-Men were, like other than the comic book nerds when I was a kid. So they also mirrored that outsiderness in society, and that nobody knew who Wolverine was when I was a kid getting into it. And
so what was it about?
I have no idea what it was that first drew me. Like that's it. Is in the comic you saw he had claws, but I didn't know anything about his healing ability. I didn't know if he had other powers or not. There was just something about the image of him in that costume, like, and the brown one, like with and there's just something about that image that drew me. And then later, like, I loved the character all through my youth. Wolverine remained consistently my favorite character from that point forward. But I honestly have no idea why he shined with meaning like that. Like, he was not important in the issue at all.
Secret Wars.
Character that had one or two lines. And it's funny, it's like, I do sometimes feel like there are parts of us that see time differently. And it's almost like a part of me recognized, hey, this is that character you're going to love right from the beginning for no reason.
That's interesting. Like the seed of it was already there.
And as I learned about the character, I can see reasons for me to get into it. Like, well, he's the only Canadian X-Men, but that was a neat coincidence for me later. He was this weird loner. And there was so much about the character that appealed to me, but none of that was present the first time I saw him. He was so background, but for some reason he just jumped right out at me.
Those images really connect with people. Like, I mean, for me, it was definitely the visuals first, you know, like I remember I had friends who had trading cards before I got into comics, and they were showing me their trading cards. And I remember, I don't know if do you remember this? I'm sure you do, but like you were talking about Wolverine not knowing anything about him. it's so, like, I know so, and you, I'm sure, know so much about comics now that it's really hard to remember when I didn't know any of that stuff. But I have like certain things that stand out to me. Like I thought that Beast and Wolverine were somehow related because they used to have the same hair. They both had that kind of hair. You know, the Loki had the hair, and I was like, what, that guy's blue, but they got the same hair. There must be some connection. And then Nightcrawler's blue. Are they related? Like, I remember trying to figure that kind of stuff out. And it was fascinating. It was like learning about a whole new world.
Yeah, and I loved finding out all those details, like going back and getting the first issue of X Factor where Beast turns blue like that. Because, you know, initially he was human. Yeah. And then it was, like, I remember being so excited when I got the X Factor issues where he encountered that mutant that turned people into monsters. Mm-hmm. And the way at first when he went into his beast, like his blue form, the more he used his strength, the stronger he got and the stupider he got.
Huh. Okay.
And so early on, he had to be careful. The more he used his strength, the stronger he'd get, but that scientist's mind would deteriorate. And eventually they found a way to like integrate it to stabilize him. But at first, the character had a vulnerability at that transition. And it was, you know, like Mr. Hyde taking over Dr. Jekyll. As one grew, the other diminished. And
I was thinking Hulk.
There were fights where, you know, the other X Factors, Cyclops and Jean and them, are telling Beast to stand back because, you know, we can't risk any more of your intelligence. But he jumped in and sacrifices even more intelligence to save everyone else.
Interesting. Yeah. Did you read the Joss Whedon Astonishing X-Men? When that came out, that was about 10 years ago now, I guess, maybe a little more.
No, I completely stopped in the 90s.
With X-Men or with all comics?
Well, I sort of stopped with comics for a time period. But then even when I got back into it, if anything, I went older. Like, I loved getting when they re-released, you know, all the first issues of X-Men, the first. Yeah. As an adult, my favorite time period is from, like, basically from 90 backwards is what I'm still reading. I haven't been reading the newer stuff.
You're not missing anything.
I love reading the older stuff from the 60s and or even like the really early stuff, like before it was Marvel. I'm forgetting what it was called. But back when, like the first issues of Captain America, it wasn't Marvel Comics at that point.
Right. When he was fighting Hitler and stuff,
Yeah, and when they actually put him fighting Hitler on the cover of the first issue of Captain America, not as a reflection that America was in the war, but to try to encourage America to get into the war. America wasn't involved yet. And it wasn't Stan Lee. Like, he was involved in the company, but he was lower. So Jack Kirby and I forget who else, but their purpose for Captain America was essentially propaganda and to push society. They felt Nazi Germany was a real problem and that America should be involved.
Well, yeah, I mean, they were Jewish, right? The creators of, well, I mean, like a lot of the early comic book creators were Jewish, and so I know, especially with like even with the Superman story, there was like Joel. I'm blanking on the names, but there was they had a strong anti-Nazi kick that was like pushed strongly through their comic books in that era. You know, everybody in the comic book world seemed united about getting the U.S. involved before the U.S. was involved.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it seems to me like, for some reason, comic books, that medium, had a very strong anti-racist sentiment from the beginning. It had a very strong sort of inclusive sentiment, like whether it's Superman or the X-Men, that understanding each other, despite our difference, seemed to have been important to all of the early comic creators.
Yeah, it was, and it started early. You're right. That is interesting. It's this one area where that seems to be the case consistently. My dad, he was we were walking through a bookstore once, and he picked me up an issue of Green Lantern because it had Jon Stewart on the cover, and he was like, "Oh, it's a black Green Lantern. I'll buy you that." And I was like, "Okay." And I wasn't even big into DC. I think that might have been my first DC comic. But that was, I guess that was like late 80s, early 90s, maybe early 90s. But yeah, cutting edge comics are always kind of on the forefront of that stuff. Even now, I would say that they kind of push the progressive envelope with their storytelling. And I don't know, I kind of mixed feelings about it, but it certainly is like a feature of comics, of the comic universe.
Yeah, I find the modern comics I've totally lost interest in, especially like when it comes to Marvel. Everything's getting so revamped. It's like even late 80s.
Yeah.
The history of Marvel comics was like canon. It continued, you know what I mean? They weren't, but like Wolverine's Bone Claws is past that era where I followed. And it seems they started reinventing so much. They started so much.
Yeah, that was the same time the Clone Saga started. You know.
Yeah, and it felt less real to me. Yeah, modern comics don't feel as real to me as the old ones that are that world. Although the one thing about the early Marvel is, as much as they were great for being more inclusive on race and understanding differences and whatnot, especially reading the very early shit, as much as women were present, it was not good for treating women equally early on. Like, Ross was always very worried about how cute whoever she was talking to was.
Yeah.
Was always very concerned about her hair.
And she was a domestic abuse victim too.
Who?
Janet Van Dyne, right? With Hank Pym. When they were married, there was like a big saga where Hank Pym was like abusing her, and it was like he was on the outs for a long time. They revisit it occasionally in the comics. I can't remember what years, but
I don't remember that plot part.
Yeah, that happened. He hit her in an issue of a comic. I think it was in the early 90s or the 80s, and it became a whole story about domestic abuse. So yeah, not the best time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But at least they treated it like he wasn't hitting her in the sense of that's okay. It was
true. No, it wasn't the 50s. Yeah. Well, so I guess I have one last question about just the comic world in general, and we don't have enough time, I'm sure, to talk about it in depth. But did you ever get into, and maybe this is more of a modern thing, but like, you know, Image Comics and just the indie comic companies that make comics where they have their own standalone world, they have creator-owned comics, and you know, you have somebody like Robert Kirkman who created The Walking Dead and Invincible, who were like, they just have the ability to have their own world. It's not attached to any other worlds. And did you ever get into those kind of comics?
I have like a bunch of first couple issues from different Image Comics. And I remember that's like right leading up to where I started getting out of comics in general. But I was excited at first about Image because all those great artists from Marvel went over.
Yeah, and Jim Lee went over there. And
and the visuals for Image were great, like Pitt and Max.
Yeah.
And, but something was lacking about that whole generation of characters.
I agree.
Spawn was interesting, looked fantastic, but there was something missing from that entire generation that I can't entirely put my finger on, but where I excitedly bought the first couple issues, but found while the characters looked great, they didn't resonate the way, you know, Spider-Man and Wolverine did at all for me.
And so for me too. Yeah, totally true for me. But you know, I think they made the smart move. They really made some smart business decisions because they moved to the creator-owned model where they said, let's abandon this shared universe because it's not working. Because I'm the same. I didn't care about any of those characters. I would look at them. I'd say, "Oh, Pitt, what is this?" And I don't know, and I'd move on. But now they kind of were just like, okay, let's just let people come in and create their own stories, and that's been really cool. That's where I think the best work is happening in comics now. It's not necessarily Image, but there's a lot of brands now that are doing indie comics, kind of, you know, letting the creators have their free reign, not creating part of a world, just doing their thing. And so those are definitely well worth exploring. But I agree with you on the big two. They've kind of like lost a bit of, they've lost a step in the last 15 years.
Although Walking Dead's excellent. I've only read the first 2 books of it, but Walking Dead was fantastic.
Just ended.
Oh, the comic series just ended?
Yeah, comic just ended. The last issue came out, I think, 2 months ago.
Cool. Yeah, but I liked that. It was very well written.
Yeah, that was fantastic. And his other book, Invincible, was also like one of my favorite comic books ever. It's Robert Kirkman also. They're making
the other comic he did is?
Invincible.
I don't think I've heard of that one.
Yeah, they're making a TV show off it. I think Seth Rogen and some of those guys are getting together to make a series based on it. But it's like starts off kind of like spoofing the Justice League. They've got characters that are approximate to it, and it's telling the story of a hero in that world. But it's like an homage to comics, to comic nerds everywhere. That's it. They really just tell these really cool stories, and it gets really serious, but it's also fun. It's good stuff.
And so, yeah, how much more time do you have? Do you want to like wrap it up now, or do you have?
I this has been, I mean, I could do this for hours, but I don't know if anyone's attention span is that long. We could definitely, we can wrap it up now and maybe have another conversation in the future.
Sure. Although if you have just a couple minutes, for anyone who has watched this far, with the idea of the character arc, for somebody who's, because you and me vibe in so many ways here. I look at fiction very similar. For someone who's never taken fiction that seriously up to this point, what are some tips to getting started on the actual work you do when you become, because I sort of maybe step one is to pay attention to how you react to fiction.
Yeah.
Be mindful of it. Notice what's shining to you. But then do you have any tips on how to work with that for better self-understanding, or tips for how to use fiction to improve yourself?
Sure. Well, so one thing people can do that may help them with that is just to follow my blog, because I talk about those kind of things a lot. It's so complex that it's really hard to, in one go, talk about the implications of what people learn. But it's funny that you said, pay attention as the first step, because that is the exact first step that I tell people in the process of smart streaming. And so I actually have a guide that I've created. It's free. In fact, people can go to thecharacterart.com and there's a pop-up, or you can find it on the front page. There's a smart streaming guide. And it basically walks people through that process, which is to say, what do you do when you're starting to watch, let's say, a new movie? And the first step is pay attention, put your phone down, start noticing not just what you're watching, but your reactions to it. And that advice really helps people get in the right mindset. And then the next two phases of it are, so you pay attention, and then you have your second stage where you're actually inspecting what you've learned. So there's inspection. And then the last phase is extraction, where you're actually pulling out the traits that are relevant to you, right? And then what you do with that, I think, that's the work of a lifetime, right? Because that's like saying, hey, I found something that you value more deeply than anything else, or something that really directs you in your life, or something that you've been avoiding that you really want to be doing. What do you do about that? And so that's a conversation for another day. But the Smart Streaming Guide is a great place to start, because it gives people just the framework of how to look at fiction in a way that tells you something, as opposed to just is entertainment. So yeah.
Okay, awesome. And send, just sorting myself out zero, send the links for that stuff.
Okay.
So people don't have to look it up, and Grizz or Ryan will put it in the information underneath the video, so people make it nice and easy for lazy people that they can just click a link and not have to go Google search anything. So for that. And
there's one last thing I would say just before that. So I don't usually talk about this because it's kind of a personal project of mine, but you might find it interesting, and people who are interested in the talk about comics might find it interesting. But the Character Arc's Instagram account, which I run, posts every other day, and I post what I call poignant panels. And I just take panels from comics I'm reading that have sayings or expressions in them, or dialogue that is really on point, I think, and expresses the philosophy that I have, that I take towards life really well. And I clip them and I put them in Instagram. So if anyone's interested, they can follow that too. And I'll send you a link for that as well.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, send us all the links. And this was great. You and me have so much in common, like the reaction to fiction. And wow. Fortunately, we don't have too much in common. You're a much better, sane human being than me.
I don't know about all that. I don't know. We don't know each other very well yet. I could be crazy in ways you don't know yet.
But so anytime you want to come on to talk more about comic books or fucking anything at all, anything that's meaningful to you, I imagine we would be able to have a good conversation about.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you guys bringing me on this time and the last two times, because it's been really positive for all the people who heard about the 5-day challenge and the self-authoring collaboration group. All of them have gotten a lot out of being in those places and like getting themselves through the self-authoring suite. So I'm really passionate about that. And you guys have helped me with that selflessly and continually. So I really appreciate it. And I couldn't have asked for a more interesting, fun conversation to have on my Wednesday afternoon. So thanks for getting up early. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I loved it. Yeah, just anytime, whether it's the self-authoring shit, character arc stuff, or something completely unrelated to all of this, you're just, a great conversation partner. So let me know anytime you want to talk.
I certainly will. I'll definitely be reaching out.
All right. So anything else?
No, I think that'll do it. I'll send you those links, and it's been a real pleasure.
Yeah. So thanks for joining me, and I'm sure we'll talk again sometime soon.
All right. Thanks, man.
All right. Bye.